Aion researches into the phenomenology of the self. These things came to pass, they say, that Jesus might be made the first sacrifice in the discrimination of composite natures. Hippolytus, Elenkos, 7th chapter. Chapter 1. The Ego. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which required the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a superordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and, insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. With this definition, we have described and delimited the scope of our subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which, therefore, is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects: those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world, the second the unknown in the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. The ego, as a specific content of consciousness, is not a simple or elementary factor, but a complex one which, as such, cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on two seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis is inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already of a psychic nature and are associated with the ego, and are therefore conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross the threshold of consciousness. A considerable proportion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is, subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely physiological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, that is, of becoming perceptions. But there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness, and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature, unless, of course, one favors the philosophical view that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by the facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague or nebulous. I have therefore suggested that the term psychic be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex or instinctual processes. Here I must refer the reader to my paper On the Nature of the Psyche, where I have discussed this definition of the psychic at somewhat greater length. The somatic basis of the ego consists, then, of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other hand, on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, aka memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from the facts underlying Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet erupted into consciousness, or which never will. When I said that the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as a whole. The ego is only the latter's point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment, and, once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and the inner. Despite the unlimited extent of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely. But this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. A total picture would have to include these. But total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible, because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. This unconscious portion, as experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help. Clearly, then, the personality of a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the fact of the unconscious, but for such a psychology the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, it should be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not, for instance, in adjudging the question of responsibility. I have suggested calling the total personality which, though present, cannot be full known, the self. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self, and is related to it, like a part to the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. By this, I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, or rather, the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outer world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence, which free will can do very little to alter. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. It is in the nature of the case, impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take account of the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are, in themselves, everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains its identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative, because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alterations of this kind need not always be pathological. They can also be developmental, and hence fall within the scope of the normal. Since it is the point of reference for the field of consciousness, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation so far as these are achieved by the will. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Carus and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is, how free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra-conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. In my experience, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious. Naturally, there is no need to say this to persons who already overestimate the latter's importance. Some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate, a point to which we shall return later on. Chapter 2. The Shadow. Whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. Their relation to the instincts has been discussed elsewhere. The archetypes most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have the most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. The most accessible of these, and the easiest to experience, is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to this rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed, and the ego, in consequence, plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it, therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work extending over a long period. Closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and according an obsessive or, better, possessive quality. And accordingly, an obsessive or, better, possessive quality. Emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. Affects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely, a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. On this lower level, with its uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive, who is not only the passive victim of his affects, but also singularly incapable of moral judgment. Although, with insight and goodwill, the shadow can to some extent be assimilated into the conscious personality, experience shows that there are certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. These resistances are usually bound up with projections, which are not recognized as such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. While some traits peculiar to the shadow can be recognized without too much difficulty as one's own personal qualities, in this case both insight and goodwill are unavailing because the cause of the emotion appears to lie, beyond all possibility of doubt, in the other person. No matter how obvious it may be to the neutral observer that it is a matter of projections, there is little hope that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections from the object. Let us suppose that a certain individual shows no inclination whatsoever to recognize his projections. The projection-making factor, then, has a free hand and can realize its object, if it has one, or bring about some other situation characteristic of its power. As we know, it is not the conscious subject, but the unconscious which does the projecting. Hence, one meets with projections, one does not make them. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. The resultant feeling of incompleteness and the still worse feeling of sterility are in their turn explained by projection as the malevolence of the environment, and by means of this vicious circle the isolation is intensified. A 45-year-old patient who had suffered from a compulsion neurosis since he was 20 and had become completely cut off from the world once said to me, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Not consciously, of course, for consciously he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world. And what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelop him. One might assume that projections like these, which are so very difficult, if not impossible, to dissolve, would belong to the realm of the shadow, that is, to the negative side of the personality. This assumption becomes untenable after a certain point, because the symbols that then appear no longer refer to the same but to the opposite sex, in a man's case to a woman and vice versa. The source of projections is no longer the shadow, which is always of the same sex as the subject, but a contrasexual figure. Here we meet the animus of a woman and the anima of a man, two corresponding archetypes, whose autonomy and unconsciousness explains the stubbornness of their projections. Though the shadow is a motive as well known to mythology as anima and animus, it represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, and its content can therefore be made conscious without too much difficulty. In this it differs from anima and animus, for whereas the shadow can be seen through and recognized fairly easily, the anima and animus are much further away from consciousness, and in normal circumstances are seldom, if ever, realized. With a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow, so far as its nature is personal. But when it appears as an archetype, one encounters the same difficulties as with anima and animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. Chapter 3. The Syzygy, Anima and Animus. What, then, is this projection-making factor? The East calls it the spinning woman, Maya, who creates illusion by her dancing. Footnote: Erwin Roussel, in his Seelische Führung im lebenden Taoismus, calls the spinning woman the animal soul. There is a saying that runs, "The spinner sets in motion." I have defined the anima as a personification of the unconscious. Had we not long since known it from the symbolism of dreams, this hint from the Orient would put us on the right track. The enveloping, embracing, and devouring element points unmistakably to the mother, that is, to the son's relation to the real mother, to her imago, and to the woman who is to become a mother for him. Footnote: Here and in what follows, the word mother is not meant in the literal sense, but as a symbol of everything that functions as a mother. His eros is passive like a child's. He hopes to be caught, sucked in, enveloped, and devoured. He seeks, as it were, the projecting, nourishing, charmed circle of the mother, the condition of the infant released from every care, in which the outside world bends over him and even forces happiness upon him. No wonder the real world vanishes from sight. If this situation is dramatized, as the unconscious usually dramatizes it, then there appears before you on the psychological stage a man living regressively, seeking his childhood and his mother, fleeing from a cold, cruel world which denies him understanding. Often, a mother appears beside him who apparently shows not the slightest concern that her little son should become a man, but who, with tireless and self-immolating effort, neglects nothing that might hinder him from growing up and marrying. You behold the secret conspiracy between mother and son, and how each helps the other to betray life. Where does the guilt lie? With the mother or with the son? Probably with both. The unsatisfied longing of the son for life and the world ought to be taken seriously. There is in him a desire to touch reality, to embrace the earth and fructify the fields of the world. But he makes no more than a series of fitful starts, for his initiative as well as his staying power are crippled by the secret memory that the world and happiness may be had as a gift from the mother. The fragment of world which he, like every man, must encounter again and again is never quite the right one, since it does not fall into his lap, does not meet him halfway, but remains resistant, has to be conquered, and submits only to force. It makes demands on the masculinity of a man, on his ardor, above all on his courage and resolution when it comes to throwing his whole being into the scales. For this you would need a faithless Eros, one capable of forgetting his mother and undergoing the pain of relinquishing the first love of his life. The mother, foreseeing this danger, has carefully inculcated into him the virtues of faithfulness, devotion, loyalty, so as to protect him from the moral disruption which is the risk of every life adventure. He has learned these lessons only too well and remains true to his mother. This naturally causes her the deepest anxiety when, to her greater glory, he turns out to be a homosexual, for example, and at the same time affords her an unconscious satisfaction that is positively mythological. For in the relationship now reigning between them, there is consummated the immemorial and most sacred archetype of the marriage of mother and son. What, after all, has commonplace reality to offer, with its registry offices, pay envelopes, and monthly rent, that could outweigh the mystic awe of the hieros gamos? Or the star-crowned woman whom the dragon pursues, or the pious obscurities veiling the marriage of the Lamb? This myth, better than any other, illustrates the nature of the collective unconscious. At this level, the mother is both old and young, Demeter and Persephone, and the son is spouse and sleeping suckling rolled into one. The imperfections of real life, with its laborious adaptations and manifold disappointments, naturally cannot compete with such a state of indescribable fulfillment. In the case of the son, the projection-making factor is identical with the mother imago, and this is consequently taken to be the real mother. The projection can only be dissolved when the son sees that in the realm of his psyche there is an imago not only of the mother, but of the daughter, the sister, the beloved, the heavenly goddess, and the chthonic Bobo. Every mother and every beloved is forced to become the carrier and embodiment of this omnipresent and ageless image, which corresponds to the deepest reality in a man. It belongs to him, this perilous image of woman. She stands for the loyalty which in the interests of life he must sometimes forego. She is the much-needed compensation for the risks, struggles, sacrifices that all end in disappointment. She is the solace for all the bitterness of life. And, at the same time, she is the great illusionist, the seductress who draws him into life with her Maya, and not only into life's reasonable and useful aspects, but into its frightful paradoxes and ambivalences where good and evil, success and ruin, hope and despair counterbalance one another. Because she is his greatest danger, she demands from a man his greatest, and if he has it in him, she will receive it. This image is my lady's soul, as Spittler called her. I have suggested instead the term anima, as indicating something specific, for which the expression soul is too general and too vague. The empirical reality summed up under the concept of the anima forms an extremely dramatic content of the unconscious. It is possible to describe this content in rational, scientific language, but in this way one entirely fails to express its living character. Therefore, in describing the living processes of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously give preference to a dramatic, mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this is not only more expressive, but also more exact than an abstract scientific terminology, which wants to toy with the notion that its theoretic formulations may one fine day be resolved into algebraic equations. The projection-making factor is the anima, or rather the unconscious as represented by the anima. Whenever she appears in dreams, visions, and fantasies, she takes on personified form, thus demonstrating that the factor she embodies possesses all the outstanding characteristics of a feminine being. She is not an invention of the conscious, but a spontaneous product of the unconscious. Nor is she a substitute figure for the mother. On the contrary, there is every likelihood that the numinous qualities which make the mother imago so dangerously powerful derive from the collective archetype of the anima, which is incarnated anew in every male child. Since the anima is an archetype that is found in men, it is reasonable to suppose that an equivalent archetype must be present in women, for just as the man is compensated by a feminine element, so woman is compensated by a masculine one. I do not, however, wish this argument to give the impression that these compensatory relationships were arrived at by deduction. On the contrary, long and varied existence was needed in order to grasp the nature of anima and animus empirically. Whatever we have to say about these archetypes, therefore, is either directly verifiable, or at least rendered probable by the facts. At the same time, I am fully aware that we are discussing pioneer work, which by its very nature can only be provisional. Just as the mother seems to be the first carrier of the projection-making factor for the son, so is the father for the daughter. Practical experience of these relationships is made up of many individual cases presenting all kinds of variations on the same basic theme. A concise description of them can, therefore, be no more than schematic. Woman is compensated by a masculine element, and therefore her unconscious has, so to speak, a masculine imprint. This results in a considerable psychological difference between men and women, and accordingly I have called the projection-making factor in women the animus, which means mind or spirit. The animus corresponds to the paternal logos, just as the anima corresponds to the maternal eros. But I do not wish or intend to give these two intuitive concepts too specific a definition. I use eros and logos merely as conceptual aids to describe the fact that women's consciousness is characterized more by the connective quality of eros than by the discrimination and cognition associated with logos. In men, eros, the function of relationship, is usually less developed than logos. In women, on the other hand, eros is an expression of their true nature, while their logos is often only a regrettable accident. It gives rise to misunderstandings and annoying interpretations in the family circle and amongst friends. This is because it consists of opinions instead of reflections, and by opinions I mean a priori assumptions that lay claim to absolute truth. Such assumptions, as everyone knows, can be extremely irritating. As the animus is partial to argument, he can best be seen at work in disputes where both parties know they are right. Men can argue in a very womanish way, too, when they are anima-possessed and have thus been transformed into the animus of their own anima. With them, the question becomes one of personal vanity and touchiness, as if they were females. With women, it is a question of power, whether of truth or justice or some other ism, for the dressmaker and hairdresser have already taken care of their vanity. The father, i.e., the sum of conventional opinions, always plays a great role in female argumentation. No matter how friendly and obliging a woman's eros may be, no logic on earth can shake her if she is ridden by the animus. Often, the man has the feeling, and he is not altogether wrong, that only seduction or a beating or rape would have the necessary power of persuasion. He is unaware that this highly dramatic situation would instantly come to a banal and unexciting end if he were to quit the field and let a second woman carry on the battle, his wife, for instance, if she herself is not the fiery war horse. This sound idea seldom or never occurs to him, because no man can converse with an animus for 5 minutes without becoming the victim of his own anima. Anyone who still had enough sense of humor to listen objectively to the ensuing dialogue would be staggered by the vast number of commonplaces, misapplied truisms, clichés from newspapers and novels, sharp-soiled platitudes of every description interspersed with vulgar abuse and brain-spitting lack of logic. It is a dialogue which, irrespective of its participants, is repeated millions and millions of times in all the languages of the world, and always remains essentially the same. This singular fact is due to the following circumstance. When animus and anima meet, the animus draws his sword of power, and the anima ejects her poison of illusion and seduction. The outcome need not always be negative, since the two are equally likely to fall in love, a special instance of love at first sight. The language of love is of astonishing uniformity, using the well-worn formulas with the utmost devotion and fidelity, so that once again the two partners find themselves in a banal collective situation. Yet they live in the illusion that they are related to one another in a most individual way. In both its positive and its negative aspects, the anima-animus relationship is always full of animosity, i.e., it is emotional and hence collective. Facts lower the level of the relationship and bring it closer to the common instinctual basis, which no longer has anything individual about it. Very often, the relationship runs its course heedless of its human performers, who afterwards do not know what happened to them. Whereas the cloud of animosity surrounding the man is composed chiefly of sentimentality and resentment, in woman it expresses itself in the form of opinionated views, interpretations, insinuations, and misconstructions, which all have the purpose, sometimes attained, of severing the relation between two human beings. The woman, like the man, becomes wrapped in a veil of illusions by her demon familiar, and, as the daughter who alone understands her father, that is eternally right in everything, she is translated to the land of sheep, where she is put to graze by the shepherd of her soul, the animus. Like the anima, the animus too has a positive aspect. Through the figure of the father he expresses not only conventional opinion, but equally what we call spirit, philosophical or religious ideas in particular, or rather the attitude resulting from them. Thus, the animus is a psychopomp, a mediator between the conscious and the unconscious, and personification of the latter. Just as the anima becomes, through integration, the eros of consciousness, so the animus becomes a logos, and in the same way that the anima gives relationship and relatedness to a man's consciousness, the animus gives a woman's consciousness a capacity for reflection, deliberation, and self-knowledge. The effect of anima and animus on the ego is in principle the same. This effect is extremely difficult to eliminate because, in the first place, it is uncommonly strong and immediately fills the ego personality with an unshakable feeling of rightness and righteousness. In the second place, the cause of the effect is projected and appears to lie in objects and objective situations. Both these characteristics can, I believe, be traced back to the peculiarities of the archetype. For the archetype, of course, exists a priori. This may possibly explain the often totally irrational, yet undisputed and indisputable existence of certain moods and opinions. Perhaps these are so notoriously difficult to influence because of the powerfully suggestive effect emanating from the archetype. Consciousness is fascinated by it, held captive as if hypnotized. Very often the ego experiences a vague feeling of moral defeat and then behaves all the more defensively, defiantly, and self-righteously, thus setting up a vicious circle which only increases its feelings of inferiority. The bottom is then knocked out of the human relationship, for, like megalomania, a feeling of inferiority makes mutual recognition impossible, and without this, there is no relationship. As I said, it is easier to gain insight into the shadow than into the anima or animus. With the shadow, we have the advantage of being prepared in some sort by our education, which has always endeavored to convince people that they are not 100% pure gold. So everyone immediately understands what is meant by shadow, inferior personality, etc. And if he has forgotten, his memory can easily be refreshed by a Sunday sermon, his wife, or the tax collector. With the anima and animus, however, things are by no means so simple. Firstly, there is no moral education in this respect, and secondly, most people are content to be self-righteous and prefer mutual vilification, if nothing worse, to the recognition of their projections. Indeed, it seems a very natural state of affairs for men to have irrational moods and women irrational opinions. Presumably the situation is grounded on instinct and must remain as it is to endure that the Empedoclean game of hate and love of the elements shall continue for all eternity. Nature is conservative and does not easily allow her courses to be altered. She defends in the most stubborn way the inviolability of the preserves where anima and animus roam. Hence it is much more difficult to become conscious of one's anima or animus projections than to acknowledge one's shadow side. One has, of course, to overcome certain moral obstacles, such as vanity, ambition, conceit, resentment, etc. But in the case of projections, all sorts of purely intellectual difficulties are added, quite apart from the contents of the projection, which one simply doesn't know how to cope with. And, on top of all of this, there arises a profound doubt as to whether one is not meddling too much with nature's business by prodding into consciousness things which it would have been better to leave asleep. Although there are, in my experience, a fair number of people who can understand without special intellectual or moral difficulties what is meant by anima and animus, one finds very many more who have the greatest trouble in visualizing these empirical concepts as anything concrete. This shows that they fall a little outside the usual range of experience. They are unpopular precisely because they seem unfamiliar. The consequence is that they mobilize prejudice and become taboo like anything else that is unexpected. So if we set it up as a kind of requirement that projections should be dissolved, because it is wholesomer that way, and in every respect more advantageous, we are entering upon new ground. Up till now, everybody has been convinced that the idea of my father, my mother, etc. is nothing but a faithful reflection of the real parent, corresponding in every detail to the original, so that when someone says, my father, he means no more and no less than what his father is in reality. This is actually what he supposes he does mean, but a supposition of identity by no means brings that identity about. This is where the fallacy of the enkekalimenos, the veiled one, comes in. This fallacy, which stems from Eubulides the Megarian, runs as follows. Can you recognize your father? Yes. Can you recognize this veiled one? No. This veiled one is your father. Hence, you can recognize your father and not recognize him. If one includes in the psychological equation X's picture of his father, which he takes for the real father, the equation will not work out, because the unknown quantity he has introduced does not tally with reality. X has overlooked the fact that his idea of a person consists, in the first place, of the possibly very incomplete picture he has received of the real person and, in the second place, of the subjective modifications he has imposed upon this picture. X's idea of his father is a complex quantity for which the real father is only in part responsible, an indefinitely larger share falling to the son. So true is this that every time he criticizes or praises his father, he is unconsciously hitting back at himself, thereby bringing about those psychic consequences that overtake people who habitually disparage or overpraise themselves. If, however, X carefully compares his reactions with reality, he stands a chance of noticing that he has miscalculated somewhere by not realizing long ago from his father's behavior that the picture he has of him is a false one. But as a rule, X is convinced that he is right, and if anybody is wrong, it must be the other fellow. Should X have a poorly developed eros, he will be either indifferent to the inadequate relationship he has with his father, or else annoyed by the inconsistency and general incomprehensibility of a father whose behavior never really corresponds to the picture X has of him. Therefore, X thinks he has every right to feel hurt, misunderstood, and even betrayed. One can imagine how desirable it would be in such cases to dissolve the projection. And there are always optimists who can believe that the golden age can be ushered in simply by telling people the right way to go. But just let them try to explain to these people that they are acting like a dog chasing its own tail. To make a person see the shortcomings of his attitude, considerably more than mere telling is needed, for more is involved than ordinary common sense can allow. What one is up against here is the kind of fateful misunderstanding which, under ordinary conditions, remains forever inaccessible to insight. It is rather like expecting the average respectable citizen to recognize himself as a criminal. I mention all this just to illustrate the order of magnitude to which the anima-animus projections belong, and the moral and intellectual exertions that are needed to dissolve them. Not all the contents of the anima and animus are projected, however. Many of them appear spontaneously in dreams and so on, and many more can be made conscious through active imagination. In this way, we find that thoughts, feelings, and effects are alive in us, which we would never have believed possible. Naturally, possibilities of this sort seem utterly fantastic to anyone who has not experienced them himself, for a normal person knows what he thinks. Such a childish attitude on the part of the normal person is simply the rule, so that no one without experience in this field can be expected to understand the real nature of anima and animus. With these reflections, one gets into an entirely new world of psychological experience, provided of course that one succeeds in realizing it in practice. Those who do succeed can hardly fail to be impressed by all that the ego does not know and never has known. This increase in self-knowledge is still very rare nowadays and is usually paid for in advance with a neurosis, if not with something worse. The autonomy of the collective unconscious expresses itself in the figures of anima and animus. They personify those of its contents which, when withdrawn from projection, can be integrated into consciousness. To this extent, both figures represent functions which filter the contents of the collective unconscious through the conscious mind. They appear or behave as such, however, only so long as the tendencies of the conscious and unconscious do not diverge too greatly. Should any tension arise, these functions, harmless till then, confront the conscious mind in personified form and behave rather like systems split off from the personality, or like part souls. This comparison is inadequate insofar as nothing previously belonging to the ego personality has split off from it. On the contrary, the two figures represent a disturbing accretion. The reason for their behaving in this way is that though the contents of anima and animus can be integrated, they themselves cannot, since they are archetypes. As such, they are the foundation stones of the psychic structure, which in its totality exceeds the limits of consciousness and therefore can never become the object of direct cognition. Though the effects of anima and animus can be made conscious, they themselves are factors transcending consciousness and beyond the reach of perception and volition. Hence, they remain autonomous despite the integration of their contents, and for this reason they should be borne constantly in mind. This is extremely important from the therapeutic standpoint, because constant observation pays the unconscious a tribute that more or less guarantees its cooperation. The unconscious, as we know, can never be done with once and for all. It is, in fact, one of the most important tasks of psychic hygiene to pay continual attention to the symptomatology of unconscious contents and processes, for the good reason that the conscious mind is always in danger of becoming one-sided, of keeping to well-worn paths and getting stuck in blind alleys. The complementary and compensating function of the unconscious ensures that these dangers, which are especially great in neurosis, can in some measure be avoided. It is only under ideal conditions, when life is still simple and unconscious enough to follow the serpentine path of instinct without hesitation or misgiving, that the compensation works with entire success. The more civilized, the more unconscious and complicated the man is, the less he is able to follow his instincts. His complicated living conditions and the influence of his environment are so strong that they drown the quiet voice of nature. Opinions, beliefs, theories, and collective tendencies appear in its stead and back up all the aberrations of the conscious mind. Deliberate attention should then be given to the unconscious, so that the compensation can set to work. Hence it is especially important to picture the archetype of the unconscious, not as a rushing phantasmagoria of fugitive images, but as constant, autonomous factors, which indeed they are. Both these archetypes, as practical experience shows, possess a fatality that can on occasion produce tragic results. They are quite literally the father and mother of all the disastrous entanglements of fate, and have long been recognized as such by the whole world. Together they form a divine pair, one of whom, in accordance with his logos nature, is characterized by pneuma and nu, rather like Hermes with his ever-shifting hues, while the other, in accordance with her eros nature, wears the features of Aphrodite, Helen, or Selene, Persephone, and Hecate. Both of them are unconscious powers, gods, in fact, as the ancient world quite rightly conceived them to be. To call them by this name is to give them that central position in the scale of psychological values, which has always been theirs, whether consciously acknowledged or not, for their power grows in proportion to the degree that they remain unconscious. Those who do not see them are in their hands, just as a typhus epidemic flourishes best when its source is undiscovered. Even in Christianity, the divine syzygy has not become obsolete, but occupies the highest place, as Christ and his bride, the Church. Parallels like these prove extremely helpful in our attempts to find the right criterion for gauging the significance of these two archetypes. What we can discover about them from the conscious side is so slight as to be almost imperceptible. It is only when we throw light into the dark depths of the psyche and explore the strange and tortuous paths of human fate that it gradually becomes clear to us how immense is the influence wielded by those two factors that complement our conscious life. Recapitulating, I should like to emphasize that the integration of the shadow, or the realization of the personal unconscious, marks the first stage in the analytic process, and that without it, a recognition of anima and animus is impossible. The shadow can be realized only through a relation to a partner, the anima and animus only through a relation to a partner of the opposite sex, because only in such a relation do their projections become operative. The recognition of the anima gives rise in a man to a triad, one-third of which is transcendent: the masculine subject, the opposing feminine subject, and a transcendent anima. With a woman, the situation is reversed. The missing fourth element that would make the triad a quaternity is, in a man, the archetype of the wise old man, which I have not discussed here, and in a woman, the chthonic mother. These four constitute a half-immanent and half-transcendent quaternity, an archetype which I have called the marriage quaternio. The marriage quaternio provides a schema not only for the self, but also for the structure of primitive society, with its cross-cousin marriage, marriage classes, and division of settlements into quarters. The self, on the other hand, is a god image, or at least cannot be distinguished from one. Of this the early Christian spirit was not ignorant, otherwise Clement of Alexandria could never have said that he who knows himself knows God. Chapter 4. The Self. We shall now turn to the question of whether the increase in self-knowledge resulting from the withdrawal of impersonal projections, in other words, the integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. To the extent that the integrated contents are parts of the self, we can expect this influence to be considerable. Their assimilation augments not only the area of the field of consciousness, but also the importance of the ego, especially when, as usually happens, the ego lacks any critical approach to the unconscious. In that case, it is easily overpowered and becomes identical with the contents that have been assimilated. In this way, for instance, a masculine consciousness comes under the influence of the anima and can even be possessed by her. I have discussed the wider elements of the integration of the unconscious contents elsewhere, and can therefore omit going into details here. I should only like to mention that the more numerous and the more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. This inevitably produces an inflation of the ego, unless a critical line of demarcation is drawn between it and the unconscious figures. But this act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego and in granting the figures of the unconscious, the self, anima, animus, and shadow, relative autonomy and reality of a psychic nature. To psychologize this reality out of existence either is ineffectual, or else merely increases the inflation of the ego. One cannot dispose of facts by declaring them unreal. The projection-making factor, for instance, has undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it, which is not only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well-being of the individual. Everyone who has dealings with such cases knows how perilous an inflation can be. No more than a flight of steps or a smooth floor is needed to precipitate a fatal fall. Besides the "pride goeth before a fall" motive, there are other factors of a no less disagreeable psychosomatic and psychic nature which serve to reduce puffed-upness. This condition should not be interpreted as one of conscious self-aggrandizement. Such is far from being the rule. In general, we are not directly conscious of this condition at all, but can at best infer its existence indirectly from the symptoms. These include the reactions of our immediate environment. Inflation magnifies the blind spot in the eye, and the more we are assimilated by the projection-making factor, the greater becomes the tendency to identify with it. A clear symptom of this is our growing disinclination to take note of the reactions of the environment and pay heed to them. It must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand it shares the archaic nature of the unconscious, and on the other finds itself in the psychically relative space-time continuum that is characteristic of the unconscious as such. Both these qualities are numinous and hence have an unlimited determining effect on ego consciousness, which is differentiated, i.e. separated from the unconscious, and moreover exists in an absolute space and an absolute time. It is a vital necessity that this should be so. If therefore the ego falls for any length of time under the control of an unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed, and the way opened for all sorts of possible accidents. Hence, it is of greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc. are of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomatology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. However, accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized and the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it is followed by the same result, inflation. The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal, and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for the dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. In the first case, mobilization of all the virtues is indicated. In the second, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by moral defeat. This is necessary, because otherwise one will never attain that median degree of modesty, which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. For instance, a man who is not conscientious enough has to make a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, while for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts, it is no small moral achievement to inflict defeat on his virtues by loosening his ties with the world and reducing his adaptive performance. One thinks of this connection of Brother Klaus, now canonized, who for the salvation of his soul left his wife to her own devices, along with numerous progeny. Since real moral problems all begin where the penal code leaves off, their solution can seldom or never depend on precedent, much less on precepts and commandments. The real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty. Anyone who is sufficiently humble or easygoing can always reach a decision with the help of some outside authority. But one who trusts others as little as himself can never reach a decision at all, unless it is brought about in the manner which common law calls an act of God. The Oxford Dictionary defines this concept as the action of uncontrollable natural forces. In all such cases, there is an unconscious authority which puts an end to doubt by creating an accomplished fact. In the last analysis, this is true also of those who get their decision from a higher authority, only in more veiled form. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces, though psychologically it makes a good deal of difference how one thinks of it. The rationalistic interpretation of this inner authority as natural forces or the instincts satisfies the modern intellect, but has the great disadvantage that the apparent victory of instinct offends our moral self-esteem. Hence we like to persuade ourselves that the manner has been decided solely by the rational motions of the will. Civilized man has such a fear of the crimen lese majestatis humanae that whenever possible he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feeling of having suffered a moral defeat. He prides himself on what he believes to be his self-control and the omnipotence of his will, and despises the man who lets himself be outwitted by mere nature. Note: crimen lese majestatis humanae are crimes which insult the king's sovereignty or person. If, on the other hand, the inner authority is conceived as the will of God, which implies that natural forces are divine forces, our self-esteem is benefited, because the decision then appears to be an act of obedience, and the result a divine intention. This way of looking at it can, with some show of justice, be accused not only of being very convenient, but of cloaking moral laxity in the mantle of virtue. The accusation, however, is justified only when one is in fact knowingly hiding one's own egoistic opinion behind a hypocritical facade of words. But this is by no means the rule, for in most cases, instinctive tendencies assert themselves for or against one's subjective interests, no matter whether an outside authority approves or not. The inner authority does not need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset in the intensity of the tendencies struggling for decision. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes part in it more or less voluntarily, and tries to throw the weight of his feeling of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much his seemingly free decision has a causal and possibly unconscious motivation. This may be quite as much of an act of God as any natural cataclysm. The problem seems to be unanswerable, because we do not know where the roots of the feeling of moral freedom lie, and yet they exist no less surely than the instincts, which are felt as compelling forces. All in all, it is not only more beneficial, but more correct psychologically to explain as the will of God the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as man has functioned at all times and in all places. The existence of this habitus is proof of its viability, for if it were not viable, all those who obeyed it would long since have perished of maladaptation. On the other hand, by conforming to it, one has a reasonable life expectancy. When a habitual way of thinking guarantees as much as this, there is not only no ground for declaring it incorrect, but, on the contrary, every reason to take it as true or correct in the psychological sense. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are habitual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving which experience has proved appropriate and useful. So when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they ought not to be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes which one must learn how to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature, and what is suppressed comes up again, in another place in altered form, but this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. I should also like the term God in the phrase the will of God to be understood, not so much in the Christian sense as in the sense intended by Diotima when she said, "Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty demon." The Greek words daimon and daimonion express a determining power, which comes upon man from outside, like providence or fate. though the ethical decision is left to man. He must know, however, that he is deciding about and what he is doing. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own invention. The purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology, because it is, in the main, intellectual only. That this should be so is not a disadvantage, since the methods of natural science have proved of great heuristic value in psychological research. But the psychic phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value, and this depends on the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. Hence, at least the two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. If, therefore, in dealing with psychic contents one makes allowance not only for intellectual judgments, but for value judgments as well, not only is the result a more complete picture of the content in question, but one also gets a better idea of the particular position it holds in the hierarchy of psychic contents in general. The feeling value is a very important criterion which psychology cannot do without, because it determines in large measure the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. That is to say, the affective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in its turn expresses that idea's energic tension, its effective potential. The shadow, for instance, usually has a decidedly negative feeling value, while the anima, like the animus, has more of a positive one. Whereas the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones, the anima and animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. Often they are surrounded by an atmosphere of sensitivity, touchy reserve, secretiveness, painful intimacy, and even absoluteness. The relative autonomy of the anima and animus figures expresses itself in these qualities. In order to effective rank, they stand to the shadow very much as the shadow stands in relation to ego consciousness. The main effective emphasis seems to lie on the latter. At any rate, it is able, by means of a considerable expenditure of energy, to repress the shadow, at least temporarily. But if for any reason the unconscious gains the upper hand, then the valency of the shadow and of the other figures increases proportionately, so the scale of values is reversed. What lay furthest away from waking consciousness and seemed unconscious assumes, as it were, a threatening shape, and the effective value increases the higher up the scale you go. Ego consciousness, shadow, anima, self. This reversal of the conscious waking state occurs regularly during the transition from waking to sleeping, and what then emerge most vividly are the very things that were unconscious by day. Every abaissement du niveau mental brings about a relative reversal of values. That piece of French that I no doubt have just butchered is a relaxed state achieved in therapy, where attention and concentration are eased, allowing inhibitions to be loosened and content to rise up from the unconscious. I am speaking here of the subjective feeling value, which is subject to the more or less periodic changes described above. But there are also objective values, which are founded on a consensus omnium, moral, aesthetic, and religious values, for instance, and these are universally recognized ideals or feeling-toned collective ideas. Lévi-Bruhl's Representations Collectives. The subjective feeling tones, or value quanta, are easily recognized by the kind and number of constellations or symptoms of disturbance they produce. Collective ideals often have no subjective feeling tone, but nevertheless retain their feeling value. This value, therefore, cannot be demonstrated by subjective symptoms, though it may be by the attributes attaching to these collective ideas and by their characteristic symbolism, quite apart from their suggestive effect. The problem has a practical aspect, since it may easily happen that a collective idea, though significant in itself, is, because of its lack of subjective feeling tone, represented in a dream only by a subsidiary attribute, as when a god is represented by his theriomorphic attribute, etc. Conversely, the idea may appear in consciousness lacking the effective emphasis that properly belongs to it, and must then be transposed back into its archetypal context, a task that is usually discharged by poets and prophets. Thus Hölderlin, in his Hymn to Liberty, lets this concept, worn stale by frequent use and misuse, rise up again in its pristine splendor. Since her arm out of the dust has raised me, beats my heart so boldly and serene, and my cheek still tingles with her kisses, flushed and glowing where her lips have been. Every word she utters by her magic rises new created without flaw. Hearken to the tidings of my goddess, hearken to the sovereign and adore. It is not difficult to see here that the idea of liberty has been changed back to its original dramatic state, into the shining figure of the anima, freed from the weight of the earth and the tyranny of the senses, the psychopomp who leads the way to the Elysian fields. The first case we mentioned, where the collective idea is represented in a dream by a lowly aspect of itself, is certainly the more frequent. The goddess appears as a black cat, and the deity as the lapis exilis, stone of no worth. Interpretation then demands a knowledge of certain things, which have less to do with zoology and mineralogy than with the existence of a historical consensus omnium in regard to the object in question. These mythological aspects are always present, even though in a given case they may be unconscious. If, for instance, one doesn't happen to recall, when considering whether to paint the Garden Gate green or white, that green is the color of life and hope, the symbolic aspect of green is nevertheless present as an unconscious sous-entendu, that is, an implication. So we find something which has the highest significance for the life of the unconscious standing lowest on the scale of conscious values, and vice versa. The figure of the shadow already belongs to the realm of bodiless phantoms, not to speak of anima and animus, which do not seem to appear at all except as projections upon our fellow human beings. As for the self, it is completely outside the personal sphere, and appears, if at all, only as a religious mythologium, and its symbols range from the highest to the lowest. Anyone who identifies with the daylight half of his psychic life will therefore declare the dreams of the night to be null and void, notwithstanding that the night is as long as the day, and that all consciousness is manifestly founded on unconsciousness, is rooted in it, and every night is extinguished in it. What is more, psychopathology knows with tolerable certainty what the unconscious can do to the conscious, and for this reason devotes to the unconscious an attention that often seems incomprehensible to the layman. We know, for instance, that what is small by day is big at night, and the other way round. Thus we also know that besides the small by day, there always looms the big by night, even when it is invisible. This knowledge is an essential prerequisite for any integration. That is to say, a content can only be integrated when its double aspect has become conscious, and when it is grasped not merely intellectually, but understood according to its feeling value. Intellect and feeling, however, are difficult to put into one harness. They conflict with one another by definition. Whoever identifies with an intellectual standpoint will occasionally find his feeling confronting him like an enemy in the guise of the anima. Conversely, an intellectual animus will make violent attacks on the feeling standpoint. Therefore, anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something not only intellectually, but also according to its feeling value, must, for better or for worse, come to grips with the anima-animus problem in order to open the way for a higher union, a conjunctio oppositorum. This is an indispensable prerequisite for wholeness. Although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea, like anima and animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated by the psyche in the form of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. These are the quaternity or Mandala symbols, which occur not only in the dreams of modern people who have never heard of them, but are widely disseminated in the historical records of many peoples and many epochs. Their significance as symbols of unity and totality is amply confirmed by history as well as by empirical psychology. What at first looks like an abstract idea stands in reality for something that exists and can be experienced, that demonstrates its a priori presence spontaneously. Wholeness is thus an objective factor that confronts the subject independently of him, like anima or animus, and just as the latter have a higher position in the hierarchy than the shadow, so wholeness lays claim to a position and a value superior to those of the syzygy. The syzygy seems to represent at least a substantial portion of it, if not actually two halves of the totality formed by the royal brother-sister pair, and hence the tension of opposites from which the divine child is born as the symbol of unity. Unity and totality stand at the highest point on the scale of objective values because their symbols can no longer be distinguished from the imago Dei. Hence, all statements about the God image apply also to the empirical symbols of totality. Experience shows that individual mandalas are symbols of order, and that they occur in patients principally during times of psychic disorientation and reorientation. As magic circles, they bind and subdue the lawless powers belonging to the world of darkness, and depict or create an order that transforms the chaos into a cosmos. The mandala at first comes into the conscious mind as an unimpressive point, or dot, and the great deal of hard and painstaking work as well as the integration of many projections are generally required before the full range of the symbols can be anything like completely understood. If this insight were purely intellectual, it could be achieved without much difficulty, for the worldwide pronouncements about the God within us and above us, about Christ and the corpus mysticum, the personal and suprapersonal Atman, etc., are all formulations that can easily be mastered by the philosophic intellect. This is the common source of the illusion that one is then in possession of the thing itself. But actually, one has acquired nothing more than its name, despite the age-old prejudice that the name magically represents the thing, and that it is sufficient to pronounce the name in order to posit the thing's existence. In the course of the millennia, the reasoning mind has been given every opportunity to see through the futility of this conceit, though that has done nothing to prevent the intellectual mastery of a thing from being accepted at its face value. It is precisely our experiences in psychology which demonstrate as plainly as could be wished that the intellectual grasp of a psychological fact produces no more than a concept of it, and that the concept is no more than a name, a flatus vocis. These intellectual counters can be bandied about easily enough. They pass lightly from hand to hand, for they have no weight or substance. They sound full, but are hollow, and though purporting to designate a heavy task and obligation, they commit us to nothing. The intellect is undeniably useful in its own field, but is a great cheat and illusionist outside of it, whenever it tries to manipulate values. It would seem that one can pursue any science with the intellect alone except psychology, whose subject, the psyche, has more than the two aspects mediated by sense perception and thinking. The function of value feeling is an integral part of our conscious orientation and ought not to be missing in a psychological judgment of any scope, otherwise the model we are trying to build of the real process will be incomplete. Every psychic process has a value quality attached to it, namely its feeling tone. This indicates the degree to which the subject is affected by the process or how much it means to him, insofar as the process reaches consciousness at all. It is through the affect that the subject becomes involved and so comes to feel the whole weight of reality. The difference amounts roughly to that between a severe illness, which one reads about in a textbook, and the real illness which one has. In psychology, one possesses nothing unless one has experienced it in reality. Hence, a purely intellectual insight is not enough, because one knows only the words and not the substance of the thing from inside. There are far more people who are afraid of the unconscious than one would expect. They are even afraid of their own shadow. And when it comes to the anima and animus, this fear turns to panic. For the syzygy does indeed represent the psychic contents that erupt into consciousness in a psychosis, most clearly of all in the paranoid forms of schizophrenia. The overcoming of this fear is often a moral achievement of unusual magnitude, and yet it is not the only condition that must be fulfilled on the way to a real experience of the self. The shadow, the syzygy, and the self are psychic factors, of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of fairly thorough experience of them. Just as these concepts arose out of an experience of reality, so they can be elucidated only by further experience. Philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts, and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of these facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a duck-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public. I have tried in a number of publications, with the help of case material, to present the nature of these experiences and also the method of obtaining them. Wherever my methods were really applied, the facts I give have been confirmed. One could see the moons of Jupiter even in Galileo's day if one took the trouble to use his telescope. Outside the narrower field of professional psychology, these figures meet with understanding from all who have any knowledge of comparative mythology. They have no difficulty in recognizing the shadow as the adverse representative of the dark chthonic world, a figure whose characteristics are universal. The syzygy is immediately comprehensible as the psychic prototype of all divine couples. Finally, the self, on account of its empirical peculiarities, proves to be the eidos behind the supreme ideas of unity and totality that are inherent in all monotheistic and monistic systems. I regard these parallels as important because it is possible through them to relate so-called metaphysical concepts, which have lost their root connection with natural experience, to living, universal psychic processes, so that they can recover their true and original meaning. In this way, the connection is re-established between the ego and projected contents now formulated as metaphysical ideas. Unfortunately, as already said, the fact that metaphysical ideas exist and are believed in does nothing to prove the actual existence of their content, or of the object they refer to, although the coincidence of idea and reality in the form of a specific psychic state, a state of grace, should not be deemed impossible, even if the subject cannot bring it about by an act of will. Once metaphysical ideas have lost their capacity to recall and evoke the original experience, they have not only become useless, but prove to be actual impediments on the road to wider development. One clings to possessions that have once meant wealth, and the more ineffective, incomprehensible, and lifeless they become, the more obstinately people cling to them. Naturally, it is only sterile ideas that they cling to. Living ideas have content and riches enough, so there is no need to cling to them. Thus, in the course of time, the meaningful turns into meaningless. This is unfortunately the fate of metaphysical ideas. Today, it is a real problem what on earth such ideas can mean. The world, so far as it has not completely turned its back on tradition, has long ago stopped wanting to hear a message. It would rather be told what the message means. The words that resound from the pulpit are incomprehensible and cry for an explanation. How has the death of Christ brought us redemption when no one feels redeemed? In what way is Jesus a God-man, and what is such a being? What is the Trinity about, and parthenogenesis, the eating of the body, and the drinking of the blood, and all the rest of it? What connection can there be between the world of such concepts and the everyday world, whose material reality is the concern of natural science on the widest possible scale? At least 16 hours out of 24 we live exclusively in this everyday world, and the remaining 8 we spend preferably in an unconscious condition. Where and when does anything take place to remind us even remotely of phenomena like angels, miraculous feedings, beatitudes, the resurrection of the dead, etc.? It was therefore something of a discovery to find that during the unconscious state of sleep intervals occur, called dreams, which occasionally contain scenes having a not inconsiderable resemblance to the motives of mythology. For myths are miracle tales and treat of all those things which, very often, are also objects of belief. In the everyday world of consciousness, such things hardly exist. That is to say, until 1933, only lunatics would have been found in possession of living fragments of mythology. After this date, the world of heroes and monsters spread like a devastating fire over whole nations, proving that the strange world of myth had suffered no loss of vitality during the centuries of reason and enlightenment. If metaphysical ideas no longer have such a fascinating effect as before, this is certainly not due to any lack of primitivity in the European psyche, but simply and solely to the fact that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. This end result is a true antimimon pneuma, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly-mindedness, criminal amorality, and doctrinaire fanaticism, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stutterings, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass man of today. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like.